Okay, last topic for the day. Research questions and hypotheses. Good research questions and hypotheses identify the target population. I mentioned that earlier already. They need to tell us who you're hypothesizing about. What's your question about? Who are they about? For quantitative research, they should identify the variables that are going to be studied. In qualitative research, you don't necessarily have to identify variables, but you have to be very clear about the phenomena of interest that you're going to be studying. And in fact, in qualitative research, hypotheses don't even really come in play until the end. That's kind of the output of qualitative research, is the hypothesis. And so qualitative inquiry doesn't have hypotheses to start out with. Then you have the idea that your research question and your hypothesis must be answerable or testable. There should be a slash there that says are answerable / testable. Then, of course, it needs to be worthwhile answering. And you achieve worthwhileness in your review of the literature and your description of the context of the problem. There has to be a problem that you're trying to address, or a gap in the literature, a gap in the understanding that you identify through a description of your summary of the literature that really brings credence to the fact that your research question is worthwhile, or your hypothesis. And of course, brevity without sacrificing clarity is really important, because it can get very hard to follow what's actually being hypothesized if you aren't being concise. Okay, so we've read through the literature, we've generated a theory, and based on that we come up with a bunch of hypotheses. So the theory informs your hypothesis. They are a bridge between the theory and then finally observation. So the hypothesis is crucial in terms of selecting your sample, for identifying your variables, and for all of your procedures and design. So here's an example of a one variable descriptive question. What are the attitudes towards interdisciplinary education of health science deans / department chairs? So the variable at play is attitudes towards interdisciplinary education, and the population of the target population is health science deans or department chairs. Another example would be, what is the level of health literacy of incoming health science students? So you could argue that this target population is not specific enough. Maybe it should be medicine students at the University of Alberta. That would be much more specific. But we do see the identification of a variable of interest, level of health literacy, the pointer towards who it is we're actually studying. Okay, so this is one variable examples. What happens when you move into the world of relationships and more than one variable? Well, there's an important distinction I'd like to make between the way you can write hypotheses and questions, and that's this idea of a relational way of writing them and a difference format. So there are two formats: the relational format, which involves explicitly saying the names of each variable in your question and hypothesis. Alternatively, you can write your question and hypothesis using a difference format, and this is where you actually refer to levels of a variable as opposed to the name of the variable itself. And so you're implicitly giving the name of the variable, but you're not actually writing it out in your hypothesis or question. The only real way to understand these concepts is to see them in action. So here's an example. So this is two variable example of questions. The first one is written in relational format, and it says, among health science educators, so there's our target population, is there a relationship between health science discipline and attitudes towards interdisciplinary education? So we see here the two variables are explicitly defined or labeled. Health science discipline, so the health science educators can be classified by health science discipline, and then we can measure their attitudes towards interdisciplinary education. So this is what we mean when we say we explicitly state the label of a variable. So this would be the relational format. In the difference format, what we have here is there a difference in the attitude towards interdisciplinary education? So in this case, this has been labeled explicitly between health science educators, there's our target population, from pharmacy, nursing, medicine, or rehab med. Okay, so here's where it became the difference format. It's the difference format because in this part of the question, the label of the variable isn't explicitly stated. Instead, the levels of the variable are referred to, so pharmacy, nursing, medicine, or rehab med. It's implied that we would understand that those are health science disciplines. You can see in this case the difference format gave us more detail about what the variable is, even though it didn't tell us what the name was. So it looks like when they're referring to health science discipline, they're limiting themselves to pharmacy, nursing, medicine, and rehab med. Now I want to show you two examples of research hypotheses written in, again, relational and difference format. Same context for each of these, so you could actually map these back to the previous slide, but this time it's written as a hypothesis instead of a question. So among health science educators, there will be differences in the, this is missing some words here, there will be differences in the attitudes towards interdisciplinary education across health science disciplines. So again, when it's written in the relational format, you see the names of the variables. Attitudes towards interdisciplinary education is one, and health science disciplines is the other. Written in the difference format, it says health science educators from nursing, pharmacy, and rehab med will have more favorable attitudes towards the interdisciplinary education, again a typo, towards interdisciplinary education than those from medicine. If I were to ask you to identify the variables at play, this one would be instantly identified, attitudes towards interdisciplinary education. The other variable would be harder to pull out. It's kind of embedded across the hypothesis. So you see nursing, pharmacy, and rehab stated first, and then finally medicine is stated at the end. Your challenge when you're trying to, when you're reading this as a consumer of research, you're trying to visualize the theory that the researcher has in their mind. And so visualizing it requires you to put labels on these variables. And so putting a label on this variable may have been a little more challenging because of the fact that it's spread out across the whole hypothesis. But essentially, you'd be saying that it's health science disciplines or some synonym of that. And essentially, what we're going to do in the class this week is you'll be posed with a series of research questions, and you'll identify the population, the target population, and the variables at play. So in the difference format, it's going to be harder to identify the variable for at least one of them, and you should keep that in mind. Okay, now I'm just going to quickly run through a couple of 3-variable examples. This first example has one independent variable and 2 dependent variables involved. So it says, will parental divorce, so whether or not a child's parents divorced, have a greater negative impact on the level of a children's school achievement than on the quality of a children's peer relationships? And so the theory that I'm building in my head is that you have parental divorce with 2 arrows coming out of it, pointing at level of children's school achievement and quality of the children's peer relationships. And so this hypothesis is about comparing the impact of parental divorce on these 2 dependent variables. The second example is the amount of time exercising will have a greater impact than the amount of time meditating on sense of well-being in university professors. So it's saying there are 2 independent variables, amount of time exercising and amount of time meditating, and both of these have an effect on sense of well-being. And the hypothesis is that exercising will be more impactful than meditating. So the picture you have in your mind is two circles, one for amount of time exercising and one for amount of time meditating, each with an arrow coming out and pointing at sense of well-being. We've already done an example of mediation, but here's a second one. I'm not going to read through this, but essentially you see the word because here. So it starts off by saying that there's a relationship between these two variables, and the reason it exists is because of this mediating variable. I will work through this moderation one because moderation is a lot harder to sort of grasp. But essentially, we have stated here, it is expected that third-year pharmacy students in practice skills labs with a smaller number of students will show higher levels of achievement than students in classes with a larger number of students. Okay, so we have a relationship between achievement, level of achievement, and the number of students in the class. So smaller numbers of students will lead to better achievement. Now it's saying, however, this effect of class size on achievement will be stronger for students with lower sort of incoming or baseline levels of achievement than students with higher baseline levels of achievement. So what I'd like you to do before coming to class on Thursday this week is try and visually represent this with a path diagram. So put the independent variable in, put the dependent variable in, and draw how the moderator is affecting the relationship between those two variables. Okay, last slide of today's screencast, finally. Rationales. So rationales are your justifications for your hypotheses, and they can be based on two different types, a logical rationale or an empirical rationale. A logical rationale is really when you've read through the literature, you've come to a logical conclusion about theory should be modified in this way, or that this is the way we should start thinking about these phenomena based on my logical understanding of these ideas. Empirical, which is very useful for convincing people that your theory makes sense. It actually involves going to the literature, finding studies that support the existence of relationships between variables already. So part of your path model actually may have already been studied, and therefore there may already be empirical evidence to support the existence of the relationship between two constructs in your theory. If there is empirical basis for parts of the hypothesis that you've stated, you should justify it using those findings. So you'll get a chance to see both logical and empirical rationales at play in that article that you're reading for preparation for tomorrow's class. We'll be using that as a basis for the activities, and that's the Simons et al. Article. Okay, so that basically covers the material for this week's module. It's a lot of material. It's dense material. The introductory material is useful for giving you context about what we're getting into. And the material on variables and hypotheses is really what we're going to be focusing on for our in-class activities. So please come prepared with questions on those two topics especially. I mean, anything's on the table, but those two topics we'll be studying in depth on Thursday.